welcome to I Love This Thing So Fricking Much, a podcast about passion. My name is Sophie Katz, and today I'm joined by Aaron, an all-around Star Wars fan. Welcome to the show, Aaron.
Hello.
Hello. So, here's how this works. Aaron will have 3 minutes to talk about something that he loves. This can be a person, place, thing, concept, activity, anything he wants. Our only requirement is that he loves it wholeheartedly and wants to tell us why. Are you ready, Aaron?
Yes, I am.
Good. Got my timer here. Now, what do you love so fricking much?
So, one thing I absolutely love is Star Wars: The High Republic. For people unfamiliar with this side of Star Wars, it's a multimedia Star Wars project that launched in 2021. It takes place over multiple phases where they've released multiple books in each phase. Right now, only two phases have been fully released, and they started releasing phase three. Phase one, for people who aren't familiar, again, it takes place about 150 to 200 years before the prequel era, which is one of the awesome things. This is a part of Star Wars that takes place in an era we're unfamiliar with. So there's a lot of really cool world building that we get to see and deal with that's not in the original trilogy or other movies or whatnot. And then phase two actually takes another jump back in time, kind of similar how the prequels took a step back in time from the original trilogy with Star Wars. And that's another jump back of about like 150 and 200 years. And then phase three, which I haven't read any yet, but it jumps back to what's happening after phase one ended. One of the really awesome things I love are the villains of the High Republic. So the villains in phase one is this group called the Nile, which are essentially like these evil, chaotic space Vikings. They're led by Marchion Ro and three Tempest runners. And Marchion Ro is this amazing planner, kind of like Emperor Palpatine, but he has his own like history and everything to him that's awesome to learn about. And then the villains of phase two are an evil cult called the Path of the Open Hand, which they believe that no one should use the Force. And it's really interesting seeing this group that believes the Force shouldn't be used at all interact with the Jedi who use the Force all the freaking time. And so there's clashes there between the Jedi and the Path of the Open Hand. Of course, though, the good guys are amazing. It's really cool seeing how the philosophy of the Jedi is different during the era, and they're way less dogmatic. And the Republic itself is in its golden era, so it's not as corrupt as you find it by the time of the prequel era. So it's really cool getting to see how Obi-Wan Kenobi essentially described the Jedi Order in the original trilogy. So, like, one of my favorite Jedi is Avar Kriss, who sees the Force as this like music aspect, and then other Jedi may see it as engineering, gears turning in their head. Whereas by the time you get to the prequels, like the Jedi have this exact philosophy of what the Force is and looks like because they've
Go ahead and finish your thought.
been less creative.
That's great. Thank you for telling us about Star Wars: The High Republic today.
Absolutely, anytime.
So, how did you first get into this series?
So how I first got into it, I learned about it before it even started releasing through a Star Wars YouTube channel. I love Star Wars Explained, who helps me keep up on all the Star Wars news going about. And I enjoy reading. So when I heard they were doing this really big publishing initiative in canon, which hasn't been done in canon up until this point, I was stoked to see what it was all about.
Did you start reading like from the beginning as they were coming out then?
Yeah, I started reading the first one literally a few days or a few weeks after it came out in January of 21. I did get a little behind because I was living abroad for a little while, but once I got back in the US, I got back on the bandwagon.
You mentioned that this was a multimedia series. How does that work?
So it takes place over adult novels, junior novels, young adult novels, adult and children's comics, and even some manga at this point. So essentially, these authors sat down, group of five authors sat down together to plan out the initial story and decide who would write what parts of it. And they've even added more authors now, starting with phase two. And the High Republic's actually gained enough popularity that it's been included a bit in Jedi Survivor, the sequel Jedi Fallen Order video game, as a heavy part of the lore in that video game. And then they have a show, The Acolyte, that's going to be releasing later this year, taking place at the very end of the era. So it's essentially put together by this story team who then goes out and writes the stories separately or together.
It sounds like there's a lot of different entry points for this series depending on who you are and what you're interested in. Like certainly there are different things you'll put in an adult book that you wouldn't necessarily put into young adult or middle grade or into a TV series or into a comic. So it sounds like there's something for everyone in here.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a lot more death in the like adult novels, a lot more characters going away, and they do not shy away from that. But for kids who want to get into it, there's younger kid novels and even short stories. And I have one friend who I've gotten into the High Republic through some of the manga because he loves manga, and it's a lot easier for him to digest a manga than sitting down and reading a book. So that was a good entry point for him. And now I have him hooked and wanting to read the books.
I bet it's a lot of fun to get your friends interested in the series that you're so into.
It definitely is. It's hard to do because you're also introducing them to an era that they're not familiar with at all. Because it's a lot easier to say, oh, here's this like Skywalker era book. That's a one-off read, but I'm over here like, no, this is like 9 books that you'd be reading long term, but it's definitely worth it for those who are willing to dive in.
Hey, you mentioned before that this is a different time. Even though the world is familiar, we're not going to see the people that we recognize from the current movies necessarily. You want to talk a little more about the world building? What are the new things that you're discovering in this familiar universe?
Yeah, so one of the best things I think I mentioned about this era is it's at the golden age. So think how Obi-Wan Kenobi was describing the Jedi in episode 4. The Jedi are at the height, they bring light. So it's really cool seeing what that means to be in the golden age. So for example, one of the awesome things about the first phase is the chancellor of the Republic at the time has this idea to create these great works. One of her great works is called Starlight Beacon, which is this giant space station that hosts a Jedi temple and others and can travel around where needed to help. But she also has the idea for this like World's Fair type of thing that they host. And so that kind of represents like, oh yeah, the Jedi Order's thriving. Phase 2 has some of its own world building because it even takes a step farther back. So you get to see the Republic like discovering new hyperspace lanes because they're much less connected and talking about like the connectivity of communication, everything is an issue at the time. There's also a bit of like, oh, some of the same technologies aren't available yet, like Bacta, which is a very familiar medical technology in later Star Wars stuff. It is just being discovered at this time. So you get to take a step back and see that golden age and some of these technologies develop and how the Jedi Order has a little bit of a different identity at the time as well before it morphs into the more dogmatic Mace Windu style order we see by the prequel era.
It sounds like the franchise has taken an opportunity to, but like you said, take a step back and see how we got here, see what must have happened historically to create the world where we meet Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke Skywalker and everyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think one of the questions the authors gave themselves when they're writing this series is what are the Jedi afraid of? And so when you're getting into this, keep that in mind. They're essentially trying to show why the Jedi became that dynamic, and it's because they became super afraid at this point in time when they were at their highest.
Is there anything that you don't like about Star Wars The High Republic? And if so, how do you handle that?
I mean, it's a lot to keep up with. It's definitely difficult sometimes to keep in order what the order of books are coming out or when they're coming out because in comics and etc. I've found that the Star Wars High Republic Reddit has some really good resources though for keeping up with that order of things. So that's how I think I deal with just keeping up with the volume of material they're releasing. But I mean, I don't think I've read a story yet that's like disappointed me. And even if it's one that's a little more lackluster than others, it's still fun seeing how it connects to other stories. So the connectivity between these stories is really well done.
Aaron, thank you so much for telling us about something you love today.
Absolutely. Anytime.
And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in today. If you'd like to learn more about Star Wars The High Republic, you can find a link to Star Wars Explained in the episode description. And if you have something you love so freaking much you want to tell me all about it, consider this your invitation to join the show. I Love This Thing So Freaking Much is a production of Through the Window Media. This episode was directed and edited by Sophie A. Katz. You can find us at Through the Window on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or Tumblr. That is THROU the Window at all the social media sites. Be good to yourself, be kind to each other, and you'll hear from us again soon.